You're watching BloombergQuint, and this quick broadcast is for all the bond market enthusiasts out there. The Reserve Bank of India has announced what we are calling India's version of Operation Twist. A very brief mention of what they have actually announced, and then we'll get views in on that. The RBI is conducting simultaneous sales and purchases of government bonds under its open market operation programs. It announced a 10,000 crore program to buy long-term bonds, and they're buying the 2029 bond, which is the current benchmark 10-year, and they're selling shorter-term bonds, 4 tranches of all bonds that are due in 2020. Essentially, by buying long-term bonds, they're hoping to bring down long-term yields. By selling short-term bonds, perhaps they would expect to see short-term yields go up. Why are they doing this? What are the implications of it? Joining us here on the show, Ananth Narayan of SP Jain Institute of Management and Research, and we'll also be joined by Arvind Chari of Quantum. Thank you both so much for joining us. Ananth, let me come to you. We were discussing this a few months back, maybe ahead of the last policy. They've done it.
Yes, indeed, Ira. They have done it, and this will be welcomed by the bond markets, which was looking for some good news anyway. So yes, what we should see is flattening out of the curve, and we'll have plenty of time debating whether this is good or bad or ugly for the medium and long term.
Okay, and I'll come to those debates, but Arvind, your first thought as well. Did you expect them to go in this direction at this stage?
We've been hearing about unconditional QE and Operation Twist. I didn't think the RBI would be bold enough to go ahead and do it, but this is a new RBI, and as Ananth said, they've actually gone and done it. And if you remember, at your show about 6-7 months back, we were discussing about the term premiums, where the spread between the 10-year and the repo rate has remained wide. Maybe so that I think that has caught their attention, and now that they've paused on the repo rate cutting cycle, this is a way to get bond yields lower. As Ananth said, we can debate on the merits of it and whether it's a short-term move or a medium-term move, but immediately we should see 10-year bond yields coming down, longer tenor bond yields also falling, which, as Ananth said, was waiting for some good news to happen.
All right, let me get into the specifics now. Ananth, firstly, can you help us understand? So, the quantum is not large right now. They've said 10,000 crore of purchases of the 2029 bond. Is that enough to make a difference? And is this being driven by the 10-year part of the curve, which is the long-term yield staying high, or is it being driven by the short end?
Look, Ira, I don't think the market will see this as a one-off. 10,000 crore alone will not make sense. So this will be seen as the first of many to go. And I guess people will be busy trying to figure out what short-end bonds are likely with the RBI, which are maturing over the next few months and quarters, for them to twist out like this. So no, this will not be a one-off. It will be seen as a sustained action. Second, I guess, look, the problem has been the steepness between the overnight rate and the 10-year bond yield. In fact, Governor Das, I think, mentioned this in the last policy as well, that while transmission into money market instruments has been very, very good, and CD rates, in fact, are much lower than the quantum of the rate cuts, the transmission into the 10-year bond yield was somewhat less enthusiastic, which means the curve steepened a lot. Now, even today, at an overnight repo rate of 5.15%, the LAF repo rate, your 10-year bond yield today closed at, 675 or so. So about 160 basis points steepness, which, given the fact that the rest of the world is extremely flat and there really isn't any demand or investment going through in the country besides the government demand, I guess that the argument was this is just too steep and coming in the way of transmission. So I guess what RBI is trying to do is not really touching liquidity as such, but trying to bring down the steepness of the curve, twist the 10-year down, even as the overnight rate anchors the short end, and therefore is hoping for transmission of lower rates to the entire ecosystem.
Okay. Arvind, would you also, any sense of where the 10-year would move on this, both signaling and the amount? Firstly, that question.
On the amount, I also believe this will not be a one-off. I kind of estimate RBI to hold about 30 to 40,000 crores of 2020 maturity bonds. So if you just step back and see, switches are not new. The government has been doing switches in the markets. In fact, last week, the government sold the 10-year bond in the market and bought back the 2020 and some other bonds. And RBI also traditionally has switched directly with the government, where they've sold the government back their 2020 near-term bonds and they buy the longer tenor. But this is happening in the market, so the impact will be slightly more. As you discussed in your own article on liquidity, given that liquidity is so much in surplus, 2.5-3 trillion rupees, even if they sell the shorter-term bonds of 40,000 crores in the months to come, short-term yields will move up a bit, but it won't be very significant. But long-term yields, which was worried more from the risks of fiscal slippages, which are still fairly high, will at least get one support from an external buyer like RBI, which is not in the market buying out and taking out supply from the market. So 10-year bonds should move down quite a bit.
Ananth, will this also push up, say, the T-bill yields? I know that there was one concern that the T-bill coupons, the 91-day T-bill coupons were coming below the repo rate at about 5%. Will this have an impact on that as well? Because the securities they're buying are obviously 2020 bonds, so I don't know if it has a direct or signaling impact.
No, I tend to agree with Arvind on this score at least, given the fact that liquidity is as big as it is, and given the fact that the operation twist by itself does not impact liquidity, and therefore it remains in surplus, that should anchor down your short-end rates. So yes, as Arvind put it well, short-end yields could go up a little bit, but that will be small in relation to the potential drop in the longer-end yields. So I think the RBI is very clear on what it wants to do. It wants to flatten the curve out and therefore bring down the term premium and aid in transmission. It will achieve that. RBI has a lot of heft in the bond markets. It can do very large interventions, and the market will respect that. And I think the RBI will get that flatter curve going forward.
Okay. Now let me come down to the government aspect of this, Ananth, and I'll stay with you on this question. I think you had pointed out time and time again that last year what supported the market were the large open market operations that the RBI had done, and that allowed the government borrowings to go through. This year they did not have the comfort of tight liquidity to do that. So in some ways, is this also a substitute for what they did last year in terms of buying long-term government bonds?
Well, I'll put it this way. Bond yields are as steep as they are for a reason. And the reason being that the amount of borrowing that the government is actually doing across central government, state government, and quasi-government bodies is enormously large. Now, while the headline fiscal deficit is what it is and what it's shown to be, the actual quantum of borrowing, in fact, across this entire decade really, has been between close to 9 to 10% of GDP. Now, this is at a time, remember, when the net household savings has actually been coming down quite sharply in the financial sector. So net household financial savings is below 7% now. Last I saw it was 6.7% of GDP. So you actually have the government and government-related bodies itself borrowing 3% more than what the total household savings in the financial sector is. So naturally, that is going to put pressure on the part of the curve where the government hits, which is the longer end of the borrowing curve. So what's really happening is you need somebody to fill that gap. You either need foreigners, foreign portfolio investors to come through. Unfortunately, they haven't been buyers in the recent past. Of course, there is hope that with the opening of the bond markets and the index inclusion, etc., they might come in the future sometime. But for now, we have this massive gap. The last year, absolutely, yes, it was the RBI which filled in that breach. Remember that between July of last year and June of this year, which is the fiscal year for the RBI, they bought 3.5 lakh crores worth of central government bonds. That's, what it was, I think, some 6-7% of the fiscal year 19's borrowing program, net borrowing program was purchased by the RBI. So that was an enormous amount of borrowing, which buying by the RBI, which helped support the bond curve. The twist is not outright purchases, but by extending the existing duration of the holding of RBI, it's essentially supporting the long-term part of the yield curve and helping, reduce the pain on the longer end of the curve. Again, whether this is good, bad, ugly, we can have a long debate about that. But yes, it does help support the borrowing program in an alternative way.
Arvind, your thoughts on that? The timing is interesting as well, right? I mean, I think everyone is now sort of given into the fact that there will be fiscal slippage. I assume if new borrowing has to be announced, it will happen in Jan or February. So the RBI has come in a little bit before that.
Yeah, we can read it like that. In fact, the choice of the bond itself, which is the 10-year bond, which is actually due to be auctioned this week. So, many people who wear the fiscal hawk hat should question this, saying that this is direct monetization, although there's no net infusion of liquidity, but this is a clear support to the bond market from the fiscal risk that it faces and the levels that Ananth pointed out. But as I said, this is a bold new RBI. If you look at the OMO number, 3.5 trillion in the last 1 year, the capital transfer from the balance sheet, and now the operation twist. So there is merit, as we said, that the term spreads are very wide. The 14-year active 10-year government bond is at 200 basis points above repo. So which we've seen only in crisis or in 2009-10 period when the fiscal slippage was even more. So the fiscal worries are there. The bond market was kind of reflecting it. And as I said, as Ananth said, the lack of an external buyer, either the RBI or a foreign buying has been very, very disappointing given where global yields are and given the nominal yields that India offers, including and very positive real yields. We should have expected more long-term money coming into government bonds. That hasn't come. And so RBI has to kind of come and at least intervene in the market to pull down spreads. But this debate should continue in terms of the merit of this and how much and how often.
Okay, in fact, that's going to be my last question to both of you, Ananth. At least under the previous regime, the previous deputy governor, for instance, had gone on record and said that we are not here to manage the price of long-term assets. So, they are wading into yield management quite directly. A question should be raised as to whether that is the function of the central bank or not.
Well, as Arvind said, this RBI clearly coordinates a lot better with the finance ministry, and I think that's good, by the way. And the governor has also mentioned that there is a need for fiscal and monetary coordination, which they're now exhibiting out here. So let me put it this way, Ira. Look, it has some positives. It has some pitfalls as well. The positives are this is good for sentiment, and God knows we need things which are good for sentiment, at least in the short run. Second, it does lower your government borrowing rates, right? It makes it cheaper for the government to borrow money. And aligned with that, remember, a lot of good names are able to borrow at close to risk-free rates, so which means their borrowing costs will come down as well. Now, what it doesn't really address is a lot of the logjam we are seeing in the credit markets right now is around a trust deficit. Either people don't, trust the borrower's balance sheet, or they're afraid they might go to jail if they might lend to some people. That doesn't really get addressed by this. You can beat the transmission drum as much as you want, but if there is a trust deficit issue, you aren't going to change that by monetary policy. Second is, yes, you do bring down, rates for people to borrow and invest, but given capacity utilizations are where they are, where is private sector investments going to come from, even if you bring down rates? So it needs a lot more to happen for that cycle to really turn using lower rates. What could happen is maybe consumer demand goes up. If you bring down mortgage rates sufficiently, maybe fresh borrowing for houses goes up, which is great for demand, etc. But remember, it's also kind of dangerous because this is coming at a time when consumer household financial savings is already very, very low on a net basis, and you're encouraging them to borrow a little more. The last bit on what could go wrong really is if it is, as Arvind says, backdoor monetization of some kind, that gives a free pass to the government to stretch its already stretched fiscal balance. If they go down that path, it effectively becomes a form of print and spend. It might sound great for now because inflation, yes, it's showing signs of pressure, but it's still manageable. The current account is still manageable. But past experiments with print and spend have never ended well for emerging markets like ours, and particularly for our own specific context. So the risk really is you have to have a tight rein to ensure this doesn't become a free pass for the government to to go completely berserk on the fiscal front. And last bit, while we continue to debate this fiscal monetary, jugalbandi, let's not forget that what's really required is economic reforms of the bank system, NBFC system, power sector, airline and shipping, telecom, manufacturing, land labor laws. Those are the things which will give us the road to the next, high-level growth, not, fiscal and monetary alchemy.
Sure. Arvind, last word to you. Similar question. I think Ananth made the point really well that this is, one part of what you can address. There are much larger issues at play right now. But I continue to ask whether the purists would like something like this or not.
I can't match Ananth on his intellect and his diverse views. I'll stick to fiscal. I think there should be no doubt, given the comments that we've seen, that the FRBM 0.5% is going to get used this year. And what the bond markets, especially I will be looking for, is what is the medium-term framework having breached the fiscal. We've seen medium-term framework being diluted in the last 4-5 years. What kind of medium-term framework do you come about which will give initial confidence that, okay, fiscal consolidation is back on track? And the reason RBI is also looking at buying the longer tenor is because the government issues longer tenor. Weighted average maturity of new issuances is something around 13-14 years. So you can add that too and say that the government, the RBI will sort of, by doing 40,000-50,000 crores of OMO, that's exactly going to be the extra borrowing that the government needs and will sort of fund the excess fiscal deficit. On the transmission bit, I agree with Ananth completely. This is not going to solve the credit transmission problem that we've seen. That's a trust deficit problem. On the bond transmission itself, if you look at NBFCs or corporate, their major borrowing curve tends to be the 3-year, 5-year segment. If you look at the 5-year government bond also, is right now at about 6.5%, 125, 130 basis points above the repo. So ideally, if you really want transmission back onto lending rates and not have an optical measure, you would want that 3 and 5-year rates yields to also come down. So we'll see how that goes. But as I said, this is not one-off, and questions will be asked about this.
All right, Ananth.
It's good for the bond market, immediate bond market sentiment for sure.
Got it. Thank you both so much for taking the time to speak to us quickly. As I said, this one was for the bond market enthusiasts who for a while have been complaining about two problems, the term premia, the credit spreads. This to some extent will address the term premia problem, bring down long-term rates, may not address the credit spread problem, which is a trust matter. Thanks for watching. Do go to BloombergQuint.com if you want to understand more.